every year we do Read Regional, and every year we tend to do it in libraries that have an active readers group. So it's such a shame that last year happened, and we've kind of lost that ability to do that. But we're so pleased to have Yvonne here with us tonight, talking about her book Remembered. So just a bit about Yvonne, and I'm holding my piece of paper, so if I'm not looking at the camera, apologies. So Yvonne is an American writer living in the UK. She's a writer of fiction and creative nonfiction, and her writing has been published in literary journals and anthologies. Winner of the Northern Writers Award in Fiction, Yvonne was shortlisted for the Words and Women competition, the Sunderland University Waterstone Sun Story Award, and awarded a Society of Authors Foundation grant for Remembered in 2018. Yvonne has a PhD in creative writing from Lancaster University and is lecturer in creative writing and creative industries at Sheffield Hallam University. Remembered was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2019. It's the story of a mother's quest to keep her son safe. For most of Edward's life, Spring has been living a lie. As an emancipated slave, if history and people have taught her anything, it's that they weren't interested in her story, her life. They only wanted her to confirm what they thought they already knew. Over time, she learned to quiet her own stories. In comforting others, she lost some of herself. Start by just saying, hello, Yvonne, welcome to us. It's a shame we're not in a library, but it is what it is. And I wanted to start really with you as a person. So, your bio says that you're an American living in Yorkshire. So I just wanted, could you tell us a bit about how your life in the States, when you came over, when you became a Yorkshire woman?
I sure will. Well, first, can I say thanks so much for having me? And like you, I was really looking forward to sitting in the library. There's just something really special about libraries. I just feel like they're such welcoming spaces, and it's one place where you can go in, and doesn't matter like how much you have, you can just sit there all day and get lost in a world of stories and kind of go places that you may not otherwise get to go, meet characters and were people in the forms of characters that you may not, otherwise get to meet. And so I've always loved libraries. They're like the best place on earth. So I came to the UK about just over 8 years ago. I brought my children with me because I wanted to do a PhD, and I wanted it to be a creative writing PhD. There were a few PhD creative writing programs in the US, but most of them were taught programs. And a colleague told me about Lancaster University. And it was a research program. It looked like everything I wanted. And honestly, I thought there was a big chance that I would be studying online. In retrospect, I'm not sure why I thought that. Like, it wasn't in the literature, it wasn't anywhere. But when I got accepted, they were saying it was accepted to be on campus. And when I asked them about that, they were saying, we just figured because of what you wanted to write about, you'd want to be here in Lancaster. And I hadn't really thought about that because I was writing about the legacy of slavery in the US. For me, I really wanted to know, one, how is the African American, Black American family healing? Who heals that trauma after slavery, but also during the Reconstruction and during the Emancipation? There were still racist principles in the US. It was still systemic racism. And of course we see that, still. And I wanted to find out how families found one another. For me as a mom, there's no greater horror than not knowing my kids are safe, and not knowing, like, every day I want them to know that they're loved. So the idea of not being able to tell them that, one, because you can't find them, or maybe you find them physically, but then emotionally you're trying, you need to rebuild those relationships. So I wanted to read about them. And so in order to do that, I wanted to write about them. I had been reading some things, like when I came to Lancaster, it was a research program, absolutely loved it. Um, and while I was reading and researching, some of the things that I was coming across were the slave narratives, and being able to read how some of the enslaved people viewed freedom. But this was, well after they had been enslaved. And also the context of it is a bit murky because of who was interviewing them, and the questions that they were asking them were often very leading. And so fiction for me can kind of do that work where history or nonfiction, or where those stories kind of let us down, they can do that work of imagining and giving life to characters who were otherwise silenced. For me, also fiction seemed the logical choice because books are what teaches me how to think and how to be and how to feel. They help me to be a more empathetic person. They remind me that everyone has a story and I don't know it. And I need to, to read it. So that means spending time with them, listening, asking active questions and engaging in order to figure that out. But I also, like during the research, I learned things about myself. And those things were more about, it's not just that books help me feel and help me process like other people, but it's how I get to know the world and navigate it on a daily basis. So in Lancaster, a friend of mine and I, we launched these events. So one of them was a true story open mic night, because what better way to get to know people than their true stories? And it was absolutely amazing. It was one of those things, it was even better than I would have hoped for, because people just, they tell their stories, and you gather them up and you learn from them, and you just learn to care for them in a number of ways, no matter where they're from, their background. It's not education, it's not ethnicity, it's not class, it's not any of those things, it's just their story. So those are like some of the things I did at Lancaster were around gathering stories, and those things ended up feeding into the book in ways that I hadn't really expected. But it ends up being about that power of stories to lead people home, and no matter how we end up defining it. But we've I think, like, at least right now, we've made our or are making a life in the UK. But in after Lancaster, after my PhD, I was offered a position at Sheffield Hallam. So I did start off, and I teach creative writing, and now I'm a principal lecturer in humanities, and I'm also the business and enterprise lead, which is spectacular, because I get to not just look at the power of stories, but also I'm a big fan of creativity in the creative industries, and using your creativity to feed your soul, but also feed your body and feed your family and pay your bills, and all those things that sometimes we don't necessarily consider, that, oh, writers need to eat, and writers have, and all those different things. And so I like that practical element of business. And so right now it's just like, it's really great to be able to combine those two passions of creativity and paying the bills.
That's a new one on me, and I have to say, there's not many authors that also have that hedge in the business side. So that's really interesting. Thank you. So I think the next thing is tell us about Remembered. Tell us, if you can tell us a bit about the book, and then that gives us some background for me then to ask you some questions about the book.
Sure. So the book is set in 1910 Philadelphia. And part of that is because I was born in Philadelphia. So it let me play around with some of the places that I kind of knew, even though I still had to research, because 1910 Philadelphia and the Philadelphia of my childhood are completely different. But it's set in 1910 Philadelphia when it opens. Spring is an emancipated slave. She's also a mother. And her son Edward has been beaten by police for a crime he may or may not have committed. He's been thrown from a street trolley. The crime that he's accused of doing is ramming the streetcar into this whites only business. And what happens next is the reason why she tells him his story. And so for her, there were things that she never told him, and a lot of that was around her being enslaved and him being born while his biological mother, which is something else she used to tell him about, while she was enslaved. And also that crafting of kind of how he came to be who he is, but in that she used to tell how she came to be who she is. So there's some the story is how the past kind of haunts the present, how we're living and reliving some of those same traumas. And she's guided along this path with Tempe, who is her dead sister. So the ghost of her sister only comes to visit her with bad news. And she comes, and so Spring knows that nothing good will come of this. But throughout the novel, they're both sort of narrating these stories that they've been carrying, but the aim of it, and both of them have different aims. They both want to lead him home, but they both have different definitions of where that might be. So so that's the book is it's historically influenced fiction. There's also set in Maryland, And that's also because I lived in Maryland for 20 years before I moved my family to the UK. Which is, it's really interesting to me because I grew up in New Jersey and I don't write about New Jersey at all. And so I'm not sure why that is. I think New Jersey is like in my, my heart, like where I'm like, oh, where's home? It's often New Jersey, or at least the New Jersey of my memory, which is like living near the ocean and that smell of the salt air and the squeal of the seagulls and all of that. And so I don't write about it. But the places that I can play around with creatively are places that I've been and feel a certain affinity to, but also a certain freedom that I can explore them on page.
Yes, it certainly doesn't have a feel of New Jersey about it, the book.
The only thing from New Jersey that made its way into the book, well, I guess two things. One would be saying use for the plural of you.
Yes, yeah.
And I think, I mean, I've always grown up saying use. And for me, it was really interesting because one of the editors, apparently I spelled it multiple ways in one of the drafts. And I think it's because it's one of those things that I say, but I know not to write.
Yes,
So when they were
yes.
like, well, how do you want to spell it? I was like, what?
That would be-
Then I had to like look it up and how do people spell it in New Jersey and how do they spell it? And I was just thinking like, I could have just changed it and could have just been like, well, the proper way is you, but there was something about yous that you just don't get in, with you, but it was that and blueberries. So I had it, so that the only thing that could grow, one of the only things that could grow on the plantation when it was haunted were blueberries. And that's because when my first job, like I was 14 years old and it was on a farm and it was picking blueberries. And my goodness, I knew I would get back at them one day. And so I thought if this place was going to be haunted, it was going to have something to do with blueberries.
So I mean, you're obviously clearly like writing from your own experience, from drawing from within you and your life experiences. Remembered is your debut novel. So what is it that drove you to tell that story?
It's the one that was, I think, that I most wanted to tell, or the one that I felt like I needed to tell. Part of that was because I needed to read it. Like I needed to feel that there were happy endings after the emancipation. As a mom, I needed to feel like families were able to reconnect in some sort of way, even though logically it wasn't like they could Google the person. It wasn't necessarily that someone was going to say, "Oh, who are you looking for? John? Oh, I remember John. I sold him 25 years ago, and I sold him to the Clarks, and the Clarks are right." Do you know what I mean? Like so the chances of them being able to find each other, there were so many things stacked up against people, and one of them might have even been time. So how do you recognize someone just because you've given birth to them 30, 40, 50 years later? I'd like to think that your heart recognizes someone, but I just don't know that to be true. And so I wanted to read those stories where people did find each other. um, and there were some like in the slave narratives, there were some stories about, families reconnecting. There were also stories about people never finding each other again. And it was interesting because in some of the interviews, they didn't dwell on it. They didn't explore it. They didn't talk about how they felt. But then also in that time, a lot of people didn't talk about how they felt. But hadn't they already learned that the people around them didn't often care about how they felt? So it wasn't as if now they were going to be like, oh, this is how I felt about it, when they'd been constantly silenced and treated as if their stories didn't matter. So for me, I felt like I needed to know that. I needed to know that there were happy endings. And I think writing it, I thought I was going to be writing happy endings. Although, of course, the more that you write and you get to know your characters and you get to know their experiences and the logic of the world that they're in, even though it's still fiction, there's still a logic to their world. And was it going to be logical that they were going to have happy endings? And of course it wasn't. So then I kind of looked at, well, one thing I wanted to make sure they had was love. And that could be in any form. It might have been just a favorite place or a name they like to be called, or romantic love, or sibling, like a family. Just I wanted them to have that, even if they didn't all actually get it. The ways that my life ended up coming into it. So the names of it, some of the names are names that I've grown up loving. And it wasn't my family. Like I have no, the names that I used, they were not people who had been enslaved. But there's just something about, for me at least, caring about them. And I always want to care about my characters. I want to, and it makes it easier for me to care about them if I can picture them and if I get to know them. So I do that through writing, but also through naming. So spring, I don't have a spring in my life, but I did have a Tempe. So my grandmother's mother's name was Tempe. I never got to meet her, but something about her name and I guess her
Yeah.
possibility just fills me with, like, a sense of love. Edward, my grandfather's name was Edward. There was also who else did I use? Agnes. My I think I just like the sound of it, but my grandmother had a sister named Agnes. So for me, if I start from a point of just love and curiosity, then I can let the characters do what they're going to do and get to know them on their own terms without like my life coming into it. But when I'm writing about place, for me to be able to see and feel a place, it really does help me if I can kind of anchor myself in it in some sort of way. And it could just be the name, like the plantation. I named it Sweetwater, which is the one nod to Sweetwater, New Jersey, which is where I grew up. But so it does, it helps me to kind of anchor it, even though there's all this fantasy and all this fiction, and anything's possible. If I have these little markers, I think it helps me to kind of make my way home.
Yes, I understand that. Where did you start doing the research for this book? Was there something that kind of started you off? Are there any particular stories that, because obviously there are some horrific and awful
Yeah.
things that happen, and I've got some questions about that a bit later, but it must have been quite a disturbing to research and there must be stories, I think, that stand out to you in that research, I'm guessing.
There are. So I didn't use real people's stories in that way because one, I felt like I didn't have that permission or that ownership of like a real person's experience and then fictionalizing it. So what I did do, it was I looked at some of the laws and some of the legislation. I looked at newspapers to kind of get a sense for the tone of how people were, speaking about people. I read historical texts, um, and part of those were just looking at that perspective and whose perspective was missing. So often it was the emancipated slave who was missing, even in that discussion around emancipation. But for me, it was kind of like, well, if all those things are missing, where do I start? So I knew what my questions were. And some of those questions were around, so what might have happened and how did families reconnect? And they were quite broad. And then I think for me, that's my way in. There was those questions that keep me curious throughout, and what might this be like and what might that be like? But then as far as a character, I first met Tempe, and it was just kind of like a feeling, like just yeah, it was more like a feeling or like a whisper. It wasn't a concrete, this is what she looks like, and in this sort of thing. I feel like it was in like little snippets and snatches of either language or of rhythms and movements, and then that curiosity. And it really helped for me that I was doing it as part of a PhD, for my PhD, because it meant that I could have these really good conversations with Jen Ashworth, who is my thesis supervisor. So with at some point, Tempe kind of she came before spring came, before I even like knew spring. I knew about Edward because the initial title and the one that I had proposed for my PhD was Letters to Edward. And for me, that meant that it was, there was going to be an Edward, even though I started writing Tempe first and I started getting to know her first, and she was that main character. And then I was looking at, well, how does she get these letters to him? And like, how does she learn to read? How does he learn to read? If she's not going to be there, then who gives him the letters and how do they know? And I was just tied to these letters. And then finally, Jen and I were having this conversation, and she was saying it like, if the title doesn't work, what else might? And then it was like, oh my goodness, yeah. And so taking the title away meant that I could open up the narrative and see where it might go. But it was definitely more, I think, Tempe's story. And she had so many scenes of love. Like, just I was so happy for her. Even even at the point when I knew she was going to die. And that was because I saw like it was like an image of her in a doorway, and the house was on fire. It was fire behind her, and it was a silhouette. And I cried like when I was like, oh my gosh. But it just, you know how like you just know that that's her ending. That's her story. Um, it broke my heart. But I also read a lot of things that people had endured, and I cried so much through the research of it. And the research in multiple ways. So reading the books that I read, reading the newspaper accounts and the textbooks, and the writing is research as well, because you do get to, you know, care for the characters the more you get to know them and you're empathizing. And sometimes they do things that you don't expect them to do. And even that is, you know, quite painful. But one of the images, one of the reasons that it was 1910, it was originally going to be 1913. But I was looking through research and looking at Philadelphia trolleys. There's a museum, and they're just the nicest people. So they're like, you know, have you seen this? Have you seen that? Have you seen this? And there was this image, and I can't even find it to this day. But there was this image of someone leaning out of a trolley, and he had like this bottle full of glass. I'm sorry, a bottle full of fire. And you figure like there's only so many things you can do with this. At some point, you're going to have to let it go. And what determination did that take to get in knowing that? Or did someone hand it to him while he was driving and he, you know, he couldn't get rid of it? Or you know, just all these different things, like how might that have happened? And so there was a riot in 1910, and it was the union workers in the company, and it got really ugly, like really quickly. And it was in Philadelphia. And I just thought, okay, so let's do 1910 and let's explore what this might be like, even though in 1910 it wouldn't have been a black character driving the trolley because they wouldn't have hired him to do it.
Oh, okay. So I was looking around at some reviews of Remembered, and obviously there's a great many of people that have enjoyed the book tremendously, me being one. The Guardian newspaper said that it was a combination of searing history with the startling interrogation of motherhood. We meet mothers who harm other women's children to protect their own, while the novel asks again and again, is the mother the woman who gives birth to a child or the woman who raises it? And I just wanted to ask how you felt about that review, how you being a mother, um, how you brought your experience to writing about those characters and those different experiences of motherhood and what that means.
So first, I love that review. I really do. And I think the book allowed me to interrogate different ideas of motherhood and to explore what it was like and potentially like for my characters. So often when we read things about enslaved people and motherhood, there's and I guess it makes it easy if you are the one oppressing someone. It makes it easier for you if you take away their humanity. So if you say, "Oh, they don't, you know, look, this person doesn't care if they have children. They don't, you know, they don't feel the same way, or they don't, they'll leave their child in the without being watched while they, you know, work in the fields, as if they have a choice." And it's this way of speaking about people as if you're not the one standing in the way of their humanity, of their autonomy. And so for me, I wanted my characters to mother in whatever way they saw fit in their parameters. So like Mother Skins does some things in order to protect Agnes, because as a mother, sometimes people make choices. And I know that I would be one of those mothers who would make choices to protect my children that might endanger someone else. And I felt like she would be one of those characters. And I can't even say like I felt like she showed me that she was one of those characters. So I would be writing and then she would do something and I'd be like, wow, I didn't see that coming. But when you look at her logic, it was like, well, what else was she going to do? Her child was in danger. And so all of the characters, they did some things that I was often surprised at, or often saddened, or just, you know, just didn't see coming. But when I looked at their logic and their truth, that was like, yeah, like what other choice would you have thought that you had? And I thought that was really interesting, because I think some people would read it and think like, because some people would say like they didn't like Mother Skins and they didn't, you know, they were, I guess, upset with like her choices. But I find it interesting that she's the one that people would be upset with, and not, you know, the slave owner who put her and the
I was
people
going to say,
around
it's
them.
choices when there aren't choices, or the choices, well, rock and a hard place, you know, those, you make choices that that make a difference to your life, but they're
Exactly.
not good choices. They're just what you have to do.
Exactly. And so I really wanted to explore what might they do. And I found that they were constantly touching, testing themselves in ways that like I didn't feel like I was going, um, how bad can I make this for you? What's going to happen if I do this? And if I put this and this and this, I felt like just in writing it, those things just, kind of happen organically. And that would be through the circumstances. And so this is going to happen. And now, wow, look at this happened. And I'm going to them like, I'm sorry, I didn't see it coming either. But, what are you going to do? And then they, do what they're going to do in the best of their circumstances. So yeah, there were times when, I wasn't expecting them to do what they did, but I could completely understand why they might do what they did. And I think for me, that's one of those gifts that I get from reading like books like Toni Morrison or Alice Walker or Zora Neale Hurston. I felt like when I first read them when I was like much younger, um, but I read them then and I got something from them. And if I read them now, I get something from them. And then what I got from them was just that reminder that people often make choices or make decisions or do things that I personally don't like and may not understand. But it may not be that I just may not get to understand it. That might not be, the gift that I'm given is understanding that. But maybe what I can do is empathize and okay, there, clearly there was a reason. And if I don't get to know it now, maybe one day I will. Or maybe I can be more patient and more understanding. So that's what books give me. And so hopefully I'm hoping that some of these characters that do some things that are challenging, that one will remember the circumstances they were in and also lay the blame where it might, actually fit.
As I was reading it, that when you kind of start off in one place and then you move kind of back in time a long way, and I think there was one bit where I kind of genuinely intake of breath because of the casual violence, just it, and it's the only way I could think to describe it, and it was the young woman supported by other women to kill herself and her unborn baby in the river by filling her mouth with rocks and walking into the river, and then you a bit further down it just describes how she's pulled from the river and her belly slit open to check whether the baby is alive. And I wanted to ask about how you write about things that the kind of in that casual way about such horrific things that happened, kind of how and why did you choose to do it that way?
I think that's a great question. And I have to say, it was so, there'll be things that you research and you find out how horrible people can be to other people. And I think once you have an idea of how horrible people can be, then, so I don't know that there was a plantation or wasn't a plantation where they would have done this, but I know that on this plantation, they wanted to make sure that if this baby had lived, that was a potential slave and that was, money for them. Um, and so there are things that were possible in this book because they're fiction, and there might be things in this book that have happened to other people but not intentionally. The thing with the baby part, that one wasn't intentional. But for me it was, I guess, getting to know their reality and writing it and looking at, okay, so what is this other person capable of? What are the people who are capable of owning other people, capable of selling other people, capable of selling their children away and ripping up their families and not considering them as people? What are these particular characters capable of? And yeah, once you kind of do that, it lets you explore in different ways. And so I think it does, I guess, the way it's written maybe does make it look like more casual. And it's interesting to me because I know there were some trigger warnings. Like I would be reading like some reviews, which I never recommend doing, but like now I only read reviews if I'm like tagged in it or something like that, because otherwise I'm like, it's probably something I didn't need to see. But I knew I was reading one and it was like TW, and it took me like longer than it should have to consider like what TW was. And I'm like, TW, like my initials are YBF. Like, I don't even know what this is. But so it was a trigger warning. And it was interesting because the person put the trigger warning because of Ella being raped.
Mm.
And that seemed to be the only act of violence that they thought there was. And I was just thinking, wow, there's so many acts of violence in there, so
Yeah.
many like potential traumas that I don't know. I guess I was thinking, like, how do you pick one? Do you know what I mean? Like, if it's going
Yes.
to be something. But then also that if you're writing about enslaved characters and about slavery, and to not expect there to be trauma, um, I don't know how, how you would do that um, in a meaningful way. And from the perspective of the enslaved, I feel like if I was to do it in a way that didn't show some of their everyday traumas, I wouldn't be doing justice
No.
to their, potential stories.
No, I mean, and it was so powerful for me reading those experiences and just putting yourself in that in well, not being able to put yourself into even imagining what that might be like to live in that way, to have everything taken away from you. When
Yeah.
Ella I don't want to give too much away, but when Ella is taken and is suddenly in a completely different situation than she's used to at all, and how she just has to adjust to that, and that is her life now. It's just incomprehensible, really.
Isn't it
Um,
though? Just the
yeah,
idea for me, if you go through it and you look at it like, with an element of logic, it really can just, you're just like, what? So you could
yeah,
steal a person and then, like, the idea that, okay, now you're mine, like, that's it, like, there's no
yeah. I
discussion,
just
there's
yeah,
no, like, that's just it. And then you're going like, actually, you didn't buy me, which is, should also be illegal, but you stole me from a place that was free. I have a family, I have people looking
yeah,
for me, and still you feel like you own own me, and then you would beat me and kill me so that I can't leave, so that my so that, it just
yeah.
makes no logical
Yes,
sense to
and you
me.
have to write about that because that's what happened, it's a hugely difficult read, but so important to read that. It would be lovely if you could read us a bit from the book now. I
I
think we've
sure can.
hopefully whetted people's appetites enough that they're really desperate to hear a bit.
So I feel like I'm just going to start from the beginning, and then I'm going to skip a bit and then just read one more page or so after that. So we're doing a bit of time traveling, and we're in 1910 Philadelphia. It's 4:30 in the morning. She's sitting there on top of the shiffer robe, rocking back and forth, swinging her legs in time to some music she heard 10, 20 years ago. She's like that, Tempe. Get something stuck in her head and it stays there like a thumbprint in wet cement. I want to ask her what she's listening to, but I haven't let on I know she's there. I can feel her watching me, smoldering, hating me for ignoring her. It serves her right. It's been nearly a year since the last time she came. She can just sit there brewing and rocking and waiting on me, like I've been waiting on her since then. Mama's dead, she had said. It was fall. She popped up in the middle of the kitchen and plopped into my favorite chair like it was hers, like she'd been there all along and hadn't wafted in, smelling of cinnamon and cedarwood, always burning, even on a crisp autumn day. She strummed her fingers on the kitchen table, fingered the cracks, waited. I turned back to the ham. Had to get supper ready in case Edward came home looking for some little bit to eat between shifts. She didn't care nothing about my ham drying out, my biscuits burning, or my heart breaking. I couldn't think of nothing worse than having my dead sister sitting in my favorite chair, talking about my dead mama. Mama been dead, Tempe, I told her. Wasn't no need turning to face her. I knew her eyes would be burning a hole in my back. She just now died. She snapped her fingers. It sounded like twigs breaking. I wanted to ask her not to do that no more. You just thought she was dead. I knew she wasn't. If you knew she wasn't dead, why wouldn't you tell me? I asked. I basted the ham in pineapple juice and honey, put the biscuits in the hot box, tidied the tea towels. When I couldn't think of nothing else to do, I turned around. The look on her face said it all. Why would she have told me? We've been keeping secrets since we were little girls. Why would death change that? So I'm going to skip forward just a little bit. Because Tempe is there bearing bad news, and still Spring knows this, but she's still happy to see her because she's still her sister. There's still love. But now her sister's trying to get her up. Hurry up. I'm up. She sits on the edge of the bed. I want to reach out and hold her, but she's wispy, like smoke. She's old. What's the use of being a ghost if you still get old? All these years, and she's still on fire. You still mad, Tempe? If I could change what happened, I would. You know I would. The air crackles. I should have saved her. If I'd gone back all those years ago, pulled her out of the house, she'd be alive. Or we'd at least both be dead. A warmed hand above my shoulder. Get dressed. I pick through dress after dress. Too flashy, too homely, too proud. If I knew what I was dressing for, I would know what to wear. The dresses are segregated by event. I flip through work, visiting, entertaining, and celebrating. Sweat slips down my neck. The room gets hotter. Soon, I'll be at the last dress. Please don't let me make it to the last dress. I skip over consoling. Holding my breath, I reach for the long, thick black dress in the back. Not yet. I breathe the thick, woody air, swallow the salty lump that rises from my belly, and get dressed. Hope. I haven't worn this one in years.
Lovely, thank you. Can you just hold the book up, Yvonne, as well? Just so lovely, thank you.
And this is my favorite copy of this book. It is so worn. It's a well-worn, well-read copy.
Yeah.
It's my it's the one that, like, when we were traveling, I would take it, and then I started writing. I do write in books anyway, but I started like writing places that I've been, so places that we've been together that I've read, and I absolutely love it because it's like this little time capsule.
Thank you for that. I've just got some questions now about kind of your writing life, your life as an author, I suppose. Going back to Remembered, you know, how long has Remembered been in your head, and then to getting it out and published and on the shelves?
So that's a great question. So I wrote it for my PhD, and it started at Lancaster. So it was, let's see, I started my PhD January 2013, and the book was published February 2019. So throughout that time, it was like page one started there. So it was the writing and the ideas and the all of that research, but it was also researching the critical component of the PhD. So for the PhD, you're doing the fiction, but then you're also doing, you know, all of that other work around the context. And so just before, when I finished like the draft and had submitted it, my friend Naomi Kruger was saying, are you going to enter the Northern Writers Awards? And I was saying no, because I don't think I'm from the North that they mean, because I'm from North America. And she said, no, I think you should just ask. And so I did ask them. And then it turned out, because I was normally resident in the north of the UK, I was eligible. So that was great. So before I even graduated, I had won for the first, I think it was 5,000 words. And with that, I met my agent, who is Elise Stillsworth, and that was wonderful. And she knew the perfect publisher. So we sent it around to other publishers as well. But Charmaine Lovegrove of Dialogue Books is indeed like the perfect publisher for Remembered. So there was the process of writing it for the PhD and editing it through that. Um, Having readers, and so some of those readers were like my friend Naomi, Jen Ashworth, um, and then just being in like groups within the PhD. And then with the Northern Writers Award and the Society of Authors Award, it meant that I could take some time. Not, I mean, I was like teaching part time, and I was doing freelance projects, and of course I was momming, and so it meant that I didn't have to worry about where that next, job was going to come through. And so during that time, I could edit for publication, which was based on Elisa's notes, and then also based on the editor's notes with the publisher. And then February 2019, Remembered was published in the UK, um, and worldwide except for US and Canada. And then in 2020, February, Remembered was published by Blackstone Publishing in the US and Canada. Um, and then it's kind of like every year there's been like something, which is kind of cool, because also in 2020, the paperback was published by the Dialogue, and in 2021 February it was published by Blackstone in paperback, and February in the US is Black History Month, to be published during a time when people are when conversations are heightened around like Black history and Black experience. And so to have it published in February, I thought was like a really special, you know, sort of thing. I think Remembered, yeah, that's been its course. And the editing of it was always interesting. And like I said, like one with the question of use, um, that one was interesting. And then there was something else that there was a fact checker, which I don't think I realized there were fact checkers for fictional books. So the fact checker had asked, she couldn't find, there's a pamphlet. Ella has a pamphlet that someone gives her when she's in church. And she couldn't find this pamphlet, like when she was doing research, but I had made it up. So I was thinking, like, it's a great thing you didn't find it, because like if you had it, it'd
It
been
wouldn't, yeah.
problematic.
As a librarian and as a reader, historical fiction is my favorite way to learn about history. I mean, I'm not a textbook reader or some nonfiction, but I much prefer to get that kind of living history, that living social history that you get from fiction, that you don't get in the same way, I don't think, from nonfiction books. So,
I'd like to think that, so like creative nonfiction, like I absolutely love it. And it's a shame for me. So have you read In Cold Blood?
no.
Truman Capote. So years ago, it was considered creative nonfiction, and it was a horrible. It was about a family who was murdered in Kansas, and I know reading it, even like reading it as creative nonfiction, like as a reader, it was just incredible that it was meant that he had interviewed the murderers, and they, like, one of them had been like really generous with information and had told him like all these different things. And but even some of those things, you're thinking, wow, like how do you know what they had for breakfast, or how do you know what they said? Like supposedly this was a random killing and they hadn't been like stalking them. So it was like, wow, how did you know the conversation they might have had before this? And they're like, oh, process of elimination. And it just kind of, you start thinking like, oh, okay. And then now it's considered a novel. And I'm like, so I think like creative nonfiction, when it's done ethically, it's you can still get to the heart of a story and still get to know people in places. And I think it's just getting to the point where you trust that, that author, that they're doing that work.
Can you tell us, have you got another project on the go? Have you got another book on the go? Can you tell us a little bit about anything that you're working on now?
Yeah, sure. So, I also write for kids. And so right now I'm writing two things. So one is, it's a novel. It's inspired by Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. And so it's I was gonna say it's more darker than what I usually write, but then I guess it's potentially with all the themes and remember that might not be true. But so it's I'm really curious about those things that are possible in a small town and how they sometimes feel maybe even no matter how many laws they have, it feels somewhat lawless because it's like anything can happen. Who are you going to tell? Who's going to rescue you from this situation when everything you have is right here? I think mostly I'm interested in it because I'm always looking at like where is home for me, and it's what what does that feel like, where is that physically on a map? And so I think my characters, poor things, are also searching for home and searching for like those ideas. So what I had thought I wanted to be writing that was about 1919 in the US, the Black Summer, sorry, the Red Summer, where it was a period of historical violence against Black people in either all Black towns or in towns that weren't all Black. There seemed to be very few safe spaces. And I had thought I wanted to write about that, but then the more I researched it, I thought it was an isolated incident. And then it turns out it was kind of widespread throughout the country. And I felt like I didn't want to write about that in that way because it's not my aim to re-traumatize anyone or to re-traumatize someone who had family who was alive during that period. And so since that's not my aim, now when I'm writing, I think it's still 1919, but now I think it's because I'm interested in the pandemic and like, so what were people writing about while people were just, I mean, dying all around? And so yeah, so I'm curious about that, but I'm also curious about like what we're writing about right now in in the pandemic and during just everything that we're going through, this kind of I like the term racial reckoning. Like I like the terms of like there's just hope and what might be possible in terms of ethnicity and racism and what's possible to change right now. So those are some of the things I'm writing about. But then I'm also writing an adventure for kids. So and that one is, it's called So Your Mom is a Superhero because she's a villain. And I love characters that get to do bad things and just get to enjoy doing bad things for the sake of it. So so those are the things I'm writing right now.
So very different, but
Well, because one makes me just laugh and gives
yes.
me like that happiness. So it's like if I can balance them, then I feel like okay. Sometimes I'm gonna write something and just be like, oh my goodness, wow, that character just like. There was a time during the draft when for the one for the adults where characters just kept dying and killing each other, and I was going, my goodness, these like you can't even trust these people. I'm afraid to like close the book because I don't know who's gonna be there when I wake up. But and so because of that, like then turning and writing to the kids part, it's kind of like, oh, this is kind of fun. Like when I'm writing about like what would a job fair for villains be like, when you need to hire like your henchmen or whatever, where do you go for that? Is there like an HR fair, and what might that look like? And then I just have so much fun with it. I'm like, just how ridiculous is this? So I think they balance it out, at least in my head they do.
Well, we're nearly out of time, so I'm looking at you, Audrey, because you look like you might want to ask a question. So did you want to ask a question?
I'd just like to say I'm very interested in the book. I haven't read it, but I will. But as a white person, the topic of slavery has always been in the back of our consciousness somewhere. And it's only recently that we, white people, have begun to own the guilt, the collective guilt about what happened in our name. So my experience of reading about slavery is very slim, actually, but I happened to come across a book by Colston Whitehead.
Yeah.
And for that to be my first venture was alarming, absolutely. And the images that I read about in that book are still with me. Yeah. And I think will always stay with me. I've seen films, I've seen 12 Years a Slave, and I've read other books about slavery, but that really hit home with me. I've been challenging myself to read it again, but I haven't managed it yet.
Yeah.
But thank you for writing about this subject, because we are just going to have to learn to talk about it as it is. You know, it's something we just cannot overlook any longer.
Thank you for that. And I think you're right. I feel like society does like to overlook it. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes it's because the conversations can be quite painful.
Yeah.
I just think it's one, that's the beauty of fiction, is being able to, we can read it and we get to see things and experience things that maybe we don't otherwise see. Like I know if I watch the news or if I experience something through read a newspaper or read a film or watch a film, sometimes it doesn't touch me in those same ways. And I
No.
don't know if it's that empathy or that intimacy that I need from a book. And also
Yeah.
because I'm hearing the voices in my head when I read it.
Yeah.
So it's like they're closer to me. But I think you're right. Colson Whitehead is an amazing writer.
Yeah.
And so if we don't write about these, I remember someone was asking me, like, why would you write about slavery like now? And
Yeah.
I feel like if we can ever get to the point where we're not living the legacy of slavery, then we don't need to write about it. But we probably still will, so that we don't continue to make the same mistakes. But because we haven't dealt with those problems and they're inherent, like in the US, the judicial system,
Yes.
it seems like a direct descendant of US slavery. And so we do have to, have these uncomfortable conversations sometimes, and we
Yeah.
have to look at, so how can we go forward, what can we do, next, what's that next step. But yeah, I think it's great that you're reading and you're challenging yourself to read
Yeah.
these books, and also to be, in those uncomfortable spaces.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's right. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Audrey.
Yeah.
So we've run out of time. Can't believe it. But I'm not going to let you go, because I'm another librarian. I heard another librarian do this, and I thought, yes, I'm going to do that with every author from now on. So just as the final question, because this is a library event, even though we're nowhere near a library, unfortunately, I want to ask have you got a favorite library, and if so, where is it?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. You know, um, I'm gonna do two of them. One of them is, I know, right? Um,
I'll let you. It's fine.
Thank you. One is still the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore, Maryland. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's filled with books. And it's just beautiful, like the architecture, and then they're still really kind. So it's this book that makes, it's a building that makes you feel like you have to be really quiet when you walk in, but you don't. It's so alive, and it's something there for every single person, and they make you feel welcome. Like as soon as you walk in, it's this really warm, welcoming place. So that one I think is the library that's like in my heart. And then also this it's in Syracuse University has a library in Florence. And when I went to Florence, it was when I fell in love with writing creative nonfiction. And I was in this library, and it was like it just felt like really unused. But I think it was, maybe the time of day and maybe the time of year, but it felt like it had these really heavy drapes and really closed, and it felt quite academic, except there was this warmth to it and this energy to it. And so even just sitting down and like rubbing your fingers along these like really old books, and it was just like, oh my gosh, this feels like, this is what home feels like. Just that you just feel so warm and so welcoming, and so just come as you are, you're here now, sort of. So those would be my two.
Lovely. Well, they're good answers, so thank you. It's been so lovely to have you, Yvonne, if only virtually, from my bedroom and your living room, or wherever you are in your house.
I'm in my living room in my comfortable chair.
We'd love you to come back, obviously, to an actual library, maybe for the next book. That would be lovely. Thank you so much, Yvonne. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And thank you, Audrey.